So again, my name is Frank Lee. I'm a grad student from UC Berkeley. And today I'd like to talk about some of our recent efforts in better understanding security notifications sent to vulnerable hosts. This is a joint work with a number of collaborators listed here across multiple institutions. Now I'm sure everyone's already wondering about how this compares to the previous talk, and indeed the subject matter is very similar. However, in our talk, we'll be focusing on a different set of vulnerabilities, particularly those affecting servers and routers, whereas Ben's talk focused on vulnerable websites. Additionally, we'll be looking at different notification factors. However, I think the two studies actually together complement each other really nicely in providing a lot deeper insights into the space of vulnerability notifications. So the previous talk already nicely framed the importance of vulnerability notifications, but just in case you missed it, let me take a second go at it from a slightly different angle. So as security researchers, over the years, we've gained a lot of experience and a lot of insights in a large number of things, such as discovering security bugs. I'm not saying we're particularly good at finding all bugs in any piece of software. We still have some work to do there, but at the very least, we regularly find high-impact security vulnerabilities. And for these vulnerabilities, over the years, we've increased our capabilities in detecting which hosts are vulnerable to a security issue. And we do this through a variety of tools and techniques, such as network scanning, intrusion detection, or network monitoring, and large-scale website crawling and analysis. A final area that we've gained a lot of experience in is identifying remedies for these vulnerabilities, such as developing patches or configuration changes. Now, there's something that's related to all three of these areas, though, that as a community, we lack a lot of significant experience and insight into, and that's taking all the great work that we've done in these different areas and realizing real-world improvements in security. There's a very simple question out there which we don't have a great answer to, which is how do we get those that are affected by a security issue to remediate? And Adam has brought this up, as has Ben. As a community, we don't have the great answer to this, and when we have tried this in the past, it's been often in a very ad hoc and rather uninformed process. And this is really what motivates our study on vulnerability notifications. The concept is extremely simple, and after Ben's talk, I'm sure you're already familiar with it, but a security researcher, of course with 5 monitors, discovers some vulnerability and identifies that a certain host is vulnerable to that security issue. He can compose a message and send it off to the admin of the host, and then hopefully the admin will resolve the security issue. Now, in principle, this is extremely simple, but when you actually start thinking about it and trying to do it in practice, a number of really simple questions come up, such as, well, do notifications work at all? And if they do work, who do you contact? What kind of information do you convey in the message itself? How do you say this message, or how do you present this to the recipient? And do operators even want to receive these notifications? Even if it is effective, is this something that they consider in their normal range of operations? Now, of course, the space of vulnerability notifications has a huge problem space and an even larger solution space, and as you'll see, Ben and my talk explore just a small portion of it. But these are some of the fundamental questions that, if anyone's trying to do notifications these days, that we think are important to answer. So in today's talk, I'd like to provide some insights from our study on answers to all of these different questions. So to gain such insights, we conduct multiple notification experiments across different vulnerabilities. So for each vulnerability, we do controlled multivariate experiments where we test different notification methodologies or different notification treatments and observe how the remediation rate differs across these different treatments. So first, let me describe what variables we're going to be testing. When it comes to who to contact about a vulnerability, we consider 3 different options, which are similar to the ones that Ben took a look at. So we look at the whois abuse contact. So given the IP address of a vulnerable host, you can look up the whois record and find the abuse email. The next 2 options both involve the network of cert organizations, but we look at 2 different ways of interfacing with the certs. One is to enter this network through a local node, so using our local US cert, since we're all US universities. And the idea here is that it'd be great if a researcher could simply send all the vulnerability information to a single entity and have that information propagated to the proper parties. The other option that we look at is actually contacting the national certs with purview over a specific host directly. So given the IP address of a vulnerable host, we geolocate it and find which national cert has purview over that area. And again, the reason why we look at both of these options is because one involves significantly more work for the notifier in actually finding out all of these different national certs to contact versus just one that they could send the information to and have it propagated to the proper parties. When we look at what to convey, the solution space for this is huge, and even the questions in the last talk already brought some of this up. But we looked at one very simple question, which is how much detail should there be in the message itself? On one hand, perhaps something that's very to the point will convince the operator or tell them immediately what the problem is so they can deal with it, but perhaps something much more detailed will actually provide them with information that they need. So we look at three variants of the messages. The first is a very terse message or to-the-point message. It's essentially just 3 or 4 sentences that says who we are, what vulnerability we detected, and what we detected on their network. It's very to the point, but very short. The second variant is a terse notification with a link to a more detailed information webpage that we set up with details such as why the vulnerability matters, how we detected it, and how they might actually remediate it. But of course, with a link, who knows if they're actually going to click on it or not. Our final option is a verbose message with all of the detail essentially in the message itself. It also has a link to the information page because it's a little longer, but all of the crucial information is in this notification itself. It also says, like, for example, how they might resolve this issue. So when we looked at how to say it, this is also another area where there's a huge solution space, and there's a lot of different ways you can present the notification to the recipient. We look at one simple question again, which is, does translating notifications help? On one hand, translating a notification into multiple different languages is a lot of work for the notifier, but on the other hand, it's also, it could potentially make the notification more effective because it overcomes the language barrier. So with these variables, we want to test different treatments on a vulnerable population. So what are the vulnerabilities that we look at? We look at 3 classes of security vulnerabilities or security misconfigurations. The first are publicly accessible industrial control systems, or ICS for short. For those of you who are unfamiliar with these are devices that allow for remote control or monitoring of physical infrastructure, such as HVAC systems, power plants, manufacturing plants, so critical stuff. But often the protocols that these devices communicate on lack basic security features, such as authentication or encryption, and vulnerabilities have been found in these protocols in the past. To find publicly accessible ICS devices, we use a ZMAP with a module that has signatures for these different protocols that was developed by some of our colleagues to scan for the IPv4 address space. And we found 45,000 publicly accessible ICS hosts based off of their work. And we also use ZMAP to follow up on scanning these over time. Our second security issue are misconfigured IPv6 firewalls, and this follows up on work that was presented at NDSS this past spring by one of my co-authors. The issue is actually very simple. When you have a dual stack host that's available on both IPv4 and IPv6, you have separate firewalls that both need to be maintained. Server administrators are usually pretty good and quite experienced with locking down IPv4. However, sometimes they forget about IPv6 and leave some service unintentionally opened, and this increases the attack surface on the dual stack host. This is especially true when the service is something that really should not be accessible, such as Telnet. So to detect these inconsistent firewall policies, we use Kata's Scamper tool, which was also developed or expanded on in the NDSS study, and we scanned the vulnerable dual stack hosts that were identified first in that NDSS paper. We found 8,000 routers and 172,000 servers that still had inconsistent firewall policies. Our final set of vulnerabilities, I'm sure everyone is already very familiar with, and these are the DDoS amplifiers, which are protocols that have been abused for the massive DDoS attacks that we've seen more and more lately. We actually observed 84,000 various amplifiers in actual attacks on the network that we were monitoring, and we decided to track these using a daily protocol scan. So we would scan for essentially the availability of charge-in, of NTP monoliths, or recursive DNS. So these are the vulnerabilities that we tested, and here are basically the strategies that we use to detect them and track them over time, and these are the populations that we'll be notifying about. So to do our experiment, though, we need to split these vulnerable hosts into different groups that are going to receive different notification treatments so that we can see how the remediation rates differ for these different treatments. So I'm just going to go at this at a high level because the paper will discuss it in much more detail. But at a high level, we find the who is abuse contact for all of these different hosts, and we group them by the hosts by these contacts. And then we randomly assign contacts to these different experiment groups that are going to receive different notification treatments. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the experiment, the table here lists the number of who is contacts that we have in each of the different data sets. So this will give you a sense that there's several thousand contacts that are going to be involved in our experiment. So I'm going to show how we actually allocate these contacts to different groups. This diagram is not to scale, so look at the paper for much more detail. But first, we split up all of our contacts by who is going to be contacted or who is going to be notified. So we first have a control group, which is a control group so we can compare our notifications against, and they won't be notified. And then we have our cert groups as well as our whois groups. Next, we figure out what we're going to convey to them in terms of the level of detail. And for the control group, since we're not sending them anything, obviously we're going to convey nothing. Although I do want to say at the end of our study, we do notify everyone. For the US cert and for national certs, we send them a verbose message. In fact, for the certs, we're not really testing out what to convey because we actually are using them as a middleman, so we're not actually directly testing out what operators will receive because the certs will end up doing whatever they typically do. So we send them a verbose email with as much detail as possible, aggregated with all hosts that are in their purview. To test the levels of detail, we actually do this for the whois group, where we split it into 3 different groups based off the levels of detail. So terse, terse plus link, and verbose. Now there's a small sliver of the whois left, and this is actually reserved for our language experiment. So for contacts in countries that we were able to obtain translations for, we reserve them for our language experiment, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail when we get there. So for actually notifying all of the different contacts in our various treatment groups, we sent emails from a Berkeley email address, and all of our notifications actually also came with a link to an anonymous survey, which served as an anonymous feedback channel for operators to actually provide us with feedback on what they thought about our detection and our notification process. And then we monitored remediation after our notifications for several months. So what did we actually see? Unfortunately, Ben has spoiled a little bit of it, but there's still some interesting tidbits. So first, do notification works? Well, if they didn't, then I could finish my talk very early, which would be nice, but we'll see if that is true or not. So the graph here shows the percent of contacts that are fixed after 2 weeks. So essentially the 2-week remediation rate for each of our different data set. And we'll be comparing the best notified group compared to the control. So we see for both ICS, the industrial control systems, or for IPv6, we see statistically significant impact from our notifications with an additional 10 to 15% of the contacts remediating compared to the control. Unfortunately, we don't see this for DDoS, which is rather unfortunate because arguably DDoS is the more serious of all of our issues. One reason why we believe why this might be the case is because there's actually been significant effort done by this community already in reducing the number of open amplifiers. Actually, Christian Rousseau just had a paper a couple years ago at USENIX about these large-scale notification campaigns. And this is actually almost a testament to how effective this might be in terms of reducing a certain security issue. As far as we know, for ICS and IPv6, there have been no large-scale notifications similarly. Another thing with DDoS is that we first detected these amplifiers in actual attacks, so this likely indicates organizations that have rather poor security stances in monitoring and managing their network. So we see clearly that in some cases, notifications can work, but this does vary domain to domain. So in the cases where it does work, so for ICS and IPv6, who should we contact? Ben already actually kind of hinted at what this is, but this is, again, the 2-week remediation rate split by the point of contact. So we actually saw that the whois contacts remediate at the highest rate. We saw that the national certs actually remediate at an improved rate as well. However, it's between the whois group and the control group, so not as well as the whois group. And unfortunately for US cert, which we had hoped would just kind of distribute our information to the rest of the cert network, they actually did not take any actions and they did not exhibit any improved remediation. So from this, we conclude that if you are trying to do notification campaigns these days, it's actually best to use the whois contact. And this is actually a rather unfortunate result because ideally as researchers, we would rely on some central entity that would make this process much easier, that there's a single organization where we can send them our information about a vulnerability and they would distribute it to the affected parties. But instead, it looks like the best results actually come if you have to do all of this work of finding the whois contacts and then actually reaching out to them individually. So when you do contact them, specifically the whois contacts, what kind of details should you provide? So we actually saw for both IPv6 and ICS that the whois verbose, so the very detailed message, performed the best with an additional 3 to 4% of the verbose contacts patching. However, under our statistical analysis framework, which is detailed more in the paper, we actually saw that this difference was not statistically significant. So there's actually still some uncertainty about how impactful detail is on a notification's effectiveness. Finally, when we looked at language, we translated the message for contacts in 4 different countries, Germany, Netherlands, Poland, and Russia. So for half of the contacts in the country, they would receive an English message, and for the other half, they would receive a translated message. And these were translated by native technical speakers. Surprisingly, we actually observed less patching from the translated message. And this was actually rather surprising and really stumped us for a while. We actually got our first insight into why this might be the case when we looked at some of the feedback provided in the free-form response section of the surveys that I mentioned were in the notifications. So essentially, they say that they expected an English message from a US institute and that our translated messages came out as very suspicious, like spam or phishing. So that's a little bit unfortunate. But ultimately, this is a rather limited result because we looked at only a small handful of countries and a small handful of languages. So future work to understand how language impacts notification effectiveness needs to look at more languages. In particular, all of our languages are European countries, so to get a global general sense of the effect of language, we need to study more global languages. Also, some of our comments noticed that specifically we're US university. So perhaps different senders actually might see different results when they translate the message. As a simple example, perhaps some organization with a much more international presence, such as Google, which has various products in various languages, perhaps their notifications in a translated, if they sent translated messages, perhaps that would come off as a lot less suspicious. So there's more work that can be done in this particular space. So one more result I want to present, and there's a lot more in the paper, is one that we didn't actually originally think of asking, but came to light when we looked at our data. And that is, when you send a notification, when should you give up hope that they're not going to do anything? It's a little bit depressing, but let me first describe what is the graph that I'm going to describe, or show here. So this is going to be a graph for IPv6, the who is verbose group, but it actually generalizes to all of our different groups that saw notifications having impact. This graph will show from day to day the change in the percent of the population that fixed compared to the previous day. So everything is relative to the previous day. So you can think of it as a daily remediation rather than an aggregate remediation amount. So here we show the results. We see that on the first day there's a lot of remediation, and on the second day there's also a lot of remediation, but this is drastically decreasing day to day. And by day 4, essentially this has tailed off, and we do not see any improved remediation. The fact that there is still a little bit of remediation left is not actually indicating further remediation due to our notifications, but this is likely just natural network churn because this actually matches the level observed in the control group. So we see that notifications effect essentially lasts roughly 3 or 4 days. If you notify somebody and they don't do anything within the first 4 or 5 days, essentially we can't from what we saw, you should not expect anything else to happen. Somewhat contrasting to what was presented in the previous talk, we also did a re-notification where we sent a second round of notifications about a month later for still vulnerable hosts. And we actually did not see any improvements in the remediation rate on this second round of notifications. So this indicated to us that whatever hurdles or challenges were blocking the operators in the first case for resolving the security issue are persistent, whether it be that they have the wrong, whether we contacted the wrong contacts, whether they lacked the capabilities or the permissions to take action, or whether they felt in their opinion that it wasn't worth dealing with this issue. Our second round of notifications did not convince them otherwise. So speaking of opinions, the other thing that we looked at was the reactions that we got to our notifications, to try and understand whether they were well received or not. So we look at this both at the email responses that we get back from our notifications as well as the survey feedback. So from the email responses, we received a total of 685 email responses, of which the vast majority were automated responses. We did receive a large number of bounces as well as a number of human responses. When we look at the human responses, we did a very simple sentiment analysis to look at what was characterized in the human responses, and we saw that the vast majority of them were positive. Over 76% of them explicitly thanked us or expressed appreciation for our notification and detection effort, which was good. About 19% were neutral. They didn't express any particular sentiment, for example, asking for more information. And we've received a small number of negative messages, about 4%. In all cases, though, none of these responses were extremely negative. No one threatened to sue us, no one threatened to attack us, no one threatened to report us to some institute, so we consider that a win. In all cases, it was actually, they simply requested that they not be included in future detection and notification rounds. When we looked at the survey, our survey was a rather simple seven question yes, no answer survey. And the survey itself, as well as our emails, are in the appendix of our paper. We actually received 57 responses. Now, while it's a 7-question survey, I just want to highlight 3 of the answers. So when we asked whether it was acceptable to detect, the vast majority said it was okay, as did the vast majority for notification. And again, most of them indicated that they would like to receive future notifications. Now, there is certainly a likely bias here of those who responded to our surveys. So most likely at the extremes of either opinions, either extremely positive or extremely negative responded. But this does give us a sense that overall our notifications were relatively well received. Of course, there is a large portion, a sizable portion of the population that did not appreciate the notifications. So moving forward, if notifications are to become a thing of the future, we do as a community need to determine how actually best to do this notification process while respecting everyone's wishes. So looking forward, I think there's a lot of different things that we can move forward in this space. First, I want to recap some of the insights that we've gained from this particular study. So we've seen that notifications can have a statistically significant impact, and it can be well received. We saw that about an additional 10 to 15% of the population actually fixed an issue. Additionally, the vast majority provided positive feedback. From what our experiments showed, we observed that if you were to do notifications today, the best result would come if you did who is verbose notifications. So verbose, very detailed messages sent to the who is contacts for a given vulnerable host. But something that I've been kind of hiding under the rug to not spoil the details, although Ben's talk already discussed it, is that ultimately notifications impact was actually rather limited. On one hand, we did have a statistically significant impact, and it is a rather sizable population that did fix the issue, 10 to 15%. But ultimately, that's a very small minority, and you'd ideally like a vast majority of the contacts to actually deal with the issue, and we only saw a small number. So I think there are some next steps that we can take to move forward in improving this. So first is more research on important notification factors. Our study, as well as the previous one, essentially just scratched the surface of the factors that can be explored, and even the Q&A session just before already brought up some issues such as how do you frame the message or how do you present the message so that it might be more formal or it might look more business-like. There are other things to explore, such as can you include incentive mechanisms that convince an operator to actually take action. Also, you could look at other notification channels. It's a little extreme, but perhaps phone calls, using some kind of application, particularly if you're an organization that has, like, say, some mobile app, contacting them through that. So there's a lot more that can be done to look at whether certain notification factors have a significant impact, because we see that in some cases the factors do actually impact the effectiveness of the notification significantly. Also, another need that our community has, and again, it might be a bit less of a research-oriented goal, is to establish a reliable security point of contact for various hosts. As Ben's talk already pointed out, they explicitly saw that a large number of contacts were not the appropriate contacts, or they were not able to reach the large majority of the contacts. And for us, we also saw that for many of our contacts, they did not appear to be the appropriate points of contacts to actually take action. So indeed, a need for a reliable point of contact where we can actually send them security issues would be highly beneficial. And for those of you who are thinking that abuse contacts are already there for that, we actually got feedback in our survey where people would actually say, like, while the abuse contact is very similar to a security contact, it's for active abuse, not for vulnerabilities where no abuse has actually happened. So indeed, there's already some idea here that there is a need for a different point of contact. A final thing I wanted to point out is a need for improving the centralized notification mechanism. So ideally, the certs would have served as this, where you can just send them your vulnerability information and they would propagate this all to the proper parties. But we've seen that while they do improve remediation, ultimately they also don't get the majority of contacts to fix an issue. So some establishment of either an improvement to the certs or some different organization that serves as the central point where a researcher can simply send all this information to them would be highly beneficial, because it would significantly reduce the overhead of performing these notification campaigns. While they're doable, if you want to contact all the WHOIS contacts, for example, they certainly are very expensive. So I believe that taking steps like these moving forward will help us better understand and gain some insights into answering that original question which I brought up, which is how do you get those that are affected by a security issue to actually remediate and fix the issue so we can improve the state of the security on the internet. All right, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions for our speaker? please come to the microphone.
Right, so George Jones, this may be obvious, but how would this all change in a commercial context where there are established relationships?
Oh yeah, so actually some previous work has looked at like this for Google, for example, and we've seen that actually when you have this business relationship or some other kind of relationship established beforehand, notifications have proven extremely effective. And this kind of goes to my point about establishing a reliable point of contacts. In those cases, because you already have this existing relationship, you can have a reliable point of contact and get your message to them. So while this has been done from more of a researcher standpoint, especially for organizations who can establish a reliable point of contact, I think notifications can be extremely effective.
Right. I believe the POC would not be such an issue, but the study of the remediation, the effectiveness even within commercial organizations.
Oh yeah,
would
certainly.
Be, I think revealing.
Yeah, certainly. Like for example, if Google were to do these kind of notifications, looking at how language affects is certainly just one example that would be interesting to look at.
All right. Bill Soley, thank you. Nice talk. Have you noticed any correlation between the remediation rates and the size of the organization?
So we didn't look at this in detail, and in part because it's sometimes hard to see how large the organization is or like what kind of metrics you would actually evaluate an organization by, especially in an automated large-scale fashion. This is something that I think would be really interesting to look at in future work, and perhaps there is actually a thing in our data that we can analyze, but we didn't look at it for this current study.
Maybe the number of IP addresses that are publicly...
Yeah, you could look at perhaps the IP address space, for example.
Okay. Thank you.
Did you consider using social networks to find points of contact?
So did we think of it? It came to mind. We did not. Obviously, we did not study it, and that's actually one of the things I think is interesting to look at for future work in terms of different notification factors. Certainly, for example, social media, such as like using Twitter, has at times proven to be a very reliable channel or a very quick channel to catch somebody's attention. That one's a little particularly challenging because if you start with an IP address of a vulnerable host, the question is how do you tie this to, say, a Twitter account? In some cases, this might be relatively straightforward for like a large organization or a large website. Perhaps like, for example, if you found a very common top 100 website, you can find their Twitter account associated with it. But when you want to do this at a large scale for like the tail end of the less popular IP addresses, it's unclear exactly how you do this, but I think certainly it's an interesting domain to look forward.
We've had some success with LinkedIn.
LinkedIn? Okay.
To find people.
Interesting.
So I have a quick question right before we finish. So I was curious about those people that requested to not be scanned and to not be notified. I mean, isn't that kind of like a head in the sand, like I don't want to know about anything approach, or?
I mean, I think at least at this point we don't really know the underlying motivations for those requests. Perhaps they feel that this might be violating their privacy, or perhaps they feel like we're actually attacking their network by detecting these security issues. It's not totally clear, but certainly since they requested it, we respected their wishes.
Good. And do you think that, sorry, did you have any cases of people that refused to believe your reports? Like that weren't just negative, like don't scan me, but that were like, no, you're wrong, there's nothing vulnerable here? So
in this case, we do see a small handful of people who say, oh, I don't believe I have this issue, and then we'll double check our data, and then we'll send them what we have, and then invariably has turned out that there indeed was an issue.
Yeah, so it seems that this is a social problem as much as kind of anything, right?
Yeah, so this actually brings up some of the other factors I can look at, such as we've thought of before perhaps providing some way for them to validate this themselves easily, like for example, a web interface. Like for example, for Heartbleed, there were things where you could check easily if your server was vulnerable, and perhaps providing such a similar interface in our notifications would also make these more effective as well.
Cool. Well, let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.